Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Hello, Beat Check listeners. I'm Gosia Woźniacka, and I'm the environmental justice reporter at The Oregonian. Today, I have the honor to host 2 guests representing the Confederated Tribes of Coos, Lower Umpqua and Siuslaw Indians, a tribal confederation that makes its home on the Oregon coast. I'd like to welcome Tribal Council Chair Brad Meeker, as well as the tribe's attorney, Rick Eichstadt. And we're going to talk about offshore wind in Oregon, what happened with the canceled auction, and what the path forward is. So let's get started. Welcome to the show, both of you.
Thank you.
So most people by now have heard of the plans to build giant floating wind turbines off the Oregon coast. It's been a controversial topic, to say the least. And your tribe has emerged as one of the most vocal opponents of this project. At the end of September, so last month, the U.S. Government canceled Oregon's offshore wind auction after Governor Kotek sent a letter asking it to halt all leasing activities. Among the key reasons the governor cited was tribal opposition. But as we all know, the federal government and the state are not done. Offshore wind is a part of Biden's plan to reduce emissions and achieve clean electricity. And Oregon has similar climate goals. In other words, we need those turbines or something else to be built in their place. And we need to figure out a way forward, including how to responsibly build clean energy projects in our state. So that's our overarching question that we're going to wrestle with today. But before we start answering that, I want to step back a little bit. Your tribal confederation has lived on Oregon's coast for many, many generations. Can you describe to us your connection with the coast and with the ocean? Because I think that's really the underpinning of why you're involved in this issue.
Yes. As you said, we've lived along the Oregon coast and on the rivers, Siuslaw, Umpqua, and Coos rivers, long before white exploration and settlement here. The ocean, rivers, and lands are the reason we're here today. The tribes have a spiritual connection with the lands and waters and all the wildlife within. We feel it's our responsibility to respect and protect the lands and waters and all within for the future of our tribes. And this also protects the non-tribal communities as well. And so, we look at these areas as our, not only is it our homelands, but it's where we came from. It's, the whole reason we're alive today. And we want to make sure that it's here for our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren.
A month ago, your tribe filed a lawsuit against the federal agency that's managing offshore wind, and with the aim to stop this offshore auction. The tribe wasn't the only voice of opposition. Fishing industry in Oregon, others in coastal communities also opposed offshore wind. But yours was the first lawsuit of this kind in Oregon. Why did your tribes decide to take this to court?
Well, and Rick can weigh in on this when I just make a short comment here. We tried everything in our power to talk to BOEM and have our questions and concerns addressed, which included a pause. And we weren't the only ones to ask for a pause. There were many others asking for pause, state and local governments, county governments. A lot of people were asking for a pause to assess what the consequences might be. But it didn't happen. And so this was a last resort for us. We didn't want to do this. We would much rather have discussion and come to a consensus as to what we could do to protect our environment. And Rick, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, as the chair said, the tribe engaged in this process on every level it could. It worked with the state. It submitted hundreds of pages of comments to BOEM. It met with BOEM. The tribe was part of a delegation of a number of West Coast tribes that went to Washington, D.C. to meet with elected officials, with agency heads, with the White House, and with BOEM. And on every level urged BOEM to slow the process down, to look at tribal concerns. And the tribe was told, listen, we can't. We're being provided direction from the White House that this shall happen by a certain date, and that BOEM doesn't have any discretion to slow it down. So that left the tribe in no other place than to bring legal action. And as the chair said, this was a not an easy decision for the tribe and the tribal council. This is not a tribe that rushes to court. This is a pretty rare occurrence for this tribe, and demonstrates that the importance of this issue and the lack of really meaningful coordination and consultation that occurred in the process.
So it sounds like this was really on the fast track, being pushed through very quickly, is what you were hearing. Yeah,
this appeared to be more of a political issue than it really was a genuine issue of trying to address climate issues. It was to meet the goal that the White House set out of a certain amount of gigawatts.
Yeah, 30 gigawatts by 2030.
Yeah,
on both coasts.
And the question there is what are the right projects and what are the right locations, and not arbitrarily saying we're going to put so many gigawatts off the coast of Oregon without regard to those impacts.
Got it. Chair Nieper, you mentioned the tribe wanted to understand what the consequences of these projects are. Can you tell me a little bit more about what type of consequences you're hoping to understand?
Well, everything we do has consequences. It doesn't matter what it is. Everything we do has consequences. Without understanding what the consequences could be to the fish, to the whales, to the wildlife, and on shore, I think it's irresponsible to move ahead without knowing what some of that is. It's not worth it if you're going to destroy the ocean and some of the best fishing on the West Coast. And not that, I'm not talking about commercial fishing or anything like that, but to save or protect the environment, both cultural and environmental resources, is what we're looking for. And if we're gonna get a gigawatt or however many gigawatts of power, what's it going to do to the environment? Something irreversible. We spend a lot of time trying to reverse the effects of other things that have been done in the past. We do restoration projects to restore, we're doing one, an old farm property, and it costs millions to do that. And so something that's not even being used anymore, but it was important at the time to fill in all that land. And now we're trying to restore it to help the salmon runs and other species. So
yeah. So what you're saying is that we shouldn't have to destroy the environment to help climate change. Yes. Essentially.
Yeah.
Is your tribe opposed to the idea of offshore wind as an idea in itself, or is it more this current process that you're concerned about?
We're not opposed to any green energy project as long as due diligence is done to protect the environment. In fact, before I was on council, the tribe passed a resolution in support of green energy and the wind energy project, with the little section in that resolution that talked about protecting the environment. Shortly after I was elected, after meetings and communications with BOEM, we became more concerned because our questions and concerns weren't being addressed, or even, they weren't even pretending to answer the questions. So we passed a second resolution, still in support, but a little more cautious and a little firmer on the environmental impacts. And then after more meetings and more communications with BOEM, we still weren't getting answers. And eventually we passed a third resolution opposing the wind energy project because of those issues. We are not opposed to green energy projects. In fact, we support those ideas.
Thank you. So I think you pretty much answered my next question. It sounds like your tribe were not opposed to offshore wind from the start. In fact, you were supportive of these ideas, and only when it became apparent that the federal government wasn't listening to your concerns is when you became alarmed and basically changed your stance on this. So I want to remind our listeners here that tribes in the U.S. are considered sovereign nations, and U.S. government agencies have an obligation to consult with them, to listen to them on a nation-to-nation basis. And in fact, President Biden a few years ago strengthened that right to consultation. The right to sit in at the same table to weigh in on these projects, because tribes have this right regardless of whether they actually own the land, regardless of whether they have a treaty. Is that correct?
That's correct. The federal laws, there's the National Environmental Policy Act, the National Historic Preservation Act, presidential executive orders, agencies' own guidance and guidelines all require consultation with tribes. In fact, the Department of Interior, which BOEM is part of, has a requirement that the department and its bureaus, such as the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, is required to seek consensus in its decision-making with tribes. And there was really no effort here to try to reach consensus with the tribe, consensus of where should the project go? Mm-hmm. What sort of studies should happen? When should those studies occur? What sort of mitigation measures, should be required? And again, that's, I think, why the tribe ended up, where it was in filing litigation, is that sort of upfront communication, coordination, and consensus seeking did not occur. And frankly, if BOEM early in the process had rolled out a map and said, okay, where should some of these projects, or where should these projects be excluded? And what sort of factors should we consider in determining where these projects should occur? I don't think we would be here. I think the tribe may still support the process. It was the unilateral nature of the project determining where they were going to occur, what time frame they were going to occur, as well as the determination to defer all of the studies, or the meaningful studies, until late in the process after leases were issued. Mm-hmm. And that really goes against the consultation principles that are laid out in federal law, and the obligation that the federal government has to act on a government-to-government basis and to protect tribal people and their resources. If
I might add too, early on, BOEM told us that any environmental assessments that were going to be done would be the responsibility of the leaseholders, which makes no sense to me at all.
Those are the developers themselves.
Yeah. And so, we expressed to BOEM how do we know what they're going to do and stuff? And they said, well, they'll be required to consult with tribes. Well, there is no requirement for private companies to consult with tribes. And so, at that point, it's completely out of our hands. And so waiting till that point is one of the things that really, concern us.
Mm-hmm. What, in your mind, what does real consultation mean to you, the type that you feel should be required?
Well, as Rick said, they're required, they should be bringing decision makers to the table. And that's part of if you read Section 2 of the White House Memorandum on Uniform Standards, which I've read a few times, for tribal consultation, it says decision makers will come to the table and attempt to come to a consensus or a mutually desired outcome. Mm-hmm. And so, and that's kind of really cutting it down, but that didn't happen. With BOEM, they came with an intent to complete this project, and they came and talked to us because they're required to talk to us. And, we had pleasant conversations, but nothing ever came of them. And so that's not a consultation. You're not coming to the table with an intent to work with tribes. You're coming to the table with the intent to complete your project, and you just tell us what you're doing. And, we don't know that they actually told us what they're doing entirely. Hmm. So it's not consultation. It's a nice visit every once in a while, but not consultation.
Got it. And I do need to mention here that I reached out to BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and about this, and the agency said, quote, it consulted with tribes every step of the way and took tribal concerns seriously. So just want to put that on the record. Obviously, you didn't feel that way. One thing that I did want to mention, because I think it's interesting, we have sort of a similar but very different project focused on wave energy in Oregon. And there's Oregon State University is pretty much finished with the construction of a wave energy site where there will be these floating wave devices. And that process was by far not as controversial as the offshore wind turbines. And that was partly because especially the fishing communities, and I don't know if tribes were included in that conversation, but they were basically asked, where would you like this project to be located? And so I thought that was interesting that these two clean energy projects had very different outcomes in terms of community support, because in one of them, the community was asked, hey, what do you think? Where do you think this should go? And the other one, the community was told, this is where it's going to go. So just wanted to mention that. I don't know if you had any comments on that particular project.
I really don't know a whole lot about it. I've heard of it, but it does not seem that it was driven the way this project was, without, respect for the community and tribes and the environment. So like I said, I don't know a whole lot about it, so I don't want to comment too much about it.
Got it.
I mean, I'll just comment that that's a good example of good process versus bad process. A good process, includes meaningful consultation. It includes reaching out to the public and the communities that are going to be impacted, so that everyone feels heard, that everyone's concerns are going to be addressed, and that it's not a unilateral decision being made, in this case, frankly, from Washington, D.C. Not only was the tribe frustrated with this process, other communities, coastal communities, commercial fishing, even the state of Oregon was really left to the whim of the decision-making of BOEM in this process. And And that's not how you buy support for, a large energy project like this. So it's process matters, consultation matters, doing your studies up front matters, and we wouldn't be where we are now if that had been done right.
I want to go back to something that we talked very briefly about at the beginning, which is your tribe, which is actually 4 different tribes in a confederation, has a very painful history on this land. This history includes the impacts of development and various land use decisions, including projects done by government agencies in the past that were pretty harmful to the land. Can you tell us a little bit about that history on the coast and how that past has impacted how you think about offshore wind and clean energy development in general today?
Well, yes. As you stated, we're made up of 4 tribes. I am Siuslaw, and I live in my homelands here in Florence. There's 2 Coos tribes, Milik and Honest Coos, and then the lower Umpqua in between us. And so, the land was taken away. There was a treaty, but it was never ratified by the federal government. And some of our tribal members, mostly Coos and some lower Umpqua and probably some Siuslaw, were basically removed from homelands and marched to a reservation north. And so eventually they were just basically booted off the reservations and left to fend for themselves. Some were given land allotments that, basically eventually were taken back because there was no means for the tribal members to work to pay for taxes and other things. So, our tribes were forced to basically blend in with the settlers that were here. The lands were basically just taken from us. There were, settlers settled on it. White settlers, took it over, were given lands or, it's the same history basically as many tribes. The lands were, the wetlands were filled in and made into farmland in some cases. For instance, the Waite Ranch that we are restoring now back to its original, hopefully, status, and others places were logged, clear cut, and replanted, and that continues today, not as much as it did, but it's all about money. And so, we believe in taking care of the lands. And so by placing these huge wind turbines out in the ocean, that's not where they're supposed to be. They're not supposed to be there. We hear about plastics and microplastics and all these things and how bad they are, but yet now we're talking about putting it back in. So, we don't know what those consequences will be. It's just, I don't even know how to say what I'm feeling about that. So we are, we feel really helpless. I do. I feel really helpless in that I don't know that we can do enough to protect those areas. And we're trying, and that's where we came with this litigation. We didn't want to do that. But here we are. And so, we want to be at the table with BOEM still. And we've had conversations with them since. And so.
Got it. Rick, anything else you want to add?
I mean, the one thing, and the chair spoke to this, just the impacts over time, how the coast and its land has changed. We're seeing imperil salmon species. Other fisheries are suffering. Impacts. We have whale species that are threatened and endangered. And part of the concern that the tribe raised to BOEM throughout the process was, many of these species are suffering a death of 1,000 cuts. And yes, offshore wind could be viewed as a relatively small impact, but those impacts cumulatively could be the tipping point. The tribe already, has an ability to fish at a much lower rate than it did historically. The tribe sees the impacts to the marine species, and it simply isn't worth rushing through a new, unproven technology without understanding its impacts. And I think that helped inform the tribe's view on this. Is there are already so many impacts, and as the chair mentioned, the tribe is really a leader in the area of restoration, bringing back wetlands, buying property and restoring it, and working with other partners, for both marine and freshwater restoration, and it's not the time to take a step backwards. And in fact, during one of the visits from the director of BOEM, she said, climate change is going to have a devastating impact on salmon. And the tribe responded and said, yes, but we don't know if these facilities are going to have a devastating impact on salmon either. We need to make sure we don't end up with a double whammy.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. Speaking to this and to what Chair Nieper said, one of the statistics I came across as I was doing reporting for these stories is that Oregon's coast has lost about 80% of its tidal wetlands and tidal forests, which is a staggering amount, of loss to development and to projects. So, this concern about how these new projects are going to impact the environment, I think are pretty legitimate, and everybody wants to know the answer to that. And hopefully we'd like to prevent that from happening on the coast and elsewhere.
If I could add one more point to this, and
yes,
the tribe had just spent a number of years trying to address the impacts of another giant energy project, the Jordan Cove liquefied natural gas terminal, which was going to be in Coos Bay, and the pipeline that was going to extend across Oregon. And again, worked with the state, local landowners, conservation groups to make sure that any impacts of that project would be addressed. And eventually that project went away. And, just as soon as that was done, that's when this issue of offshore wind, emerged. So I think, the tribe had spent a lot of time thinking about and being aware of the potential impacts that some of these big energy projects can have, regardless of, are they liquefied natural gas? Are they offshore wind? They're, as the chair said at the beginning, you can't do anything, particularly in the ocean, that's not going to have, potential serious impacts.
And we have prime examples of hydroelectric dams, another clean energy project. The government admitting that they had a devastating effect on tribal nations and the Columbia River Basin, and obviously those salmon make it out to the ocean as well. So it's not a theory. It's something that has happened in the past, and again, very legitimate concerns. You mentioned, Chair Nieper, restoration that's being done by the tribes and how expensive that is, given the amount of wetlands and forests that have been lost, to development, to past projects. How does it feel to be restoring this land, and what the costs of that are, what the effort is? Can you give us an example of a project where you're working to do this and sort of put this into perspective of let's say we were to have these offshore wind turbines and they were to have an impact, which they probably will have some sort of impact. Like, what are we envisioning in terms of restoration and what this entails?
Well, I mentioned the Weight Ranch project that we're working on now with others, and this is a piece of property that I have been driving by, other than a time when I didn't live here for about 17 years. But other than that, I've lived in this area, and I've driven past this property I'm 66 years old now, so since I was driving, and even before that with my parents and things, and it's been that way since before I was born. And now I have the opportunity before I die to see it as it's supposed to be, as it was meant to be. And so I can't tell you the excitement I have about that itself. Now, I've learned some things over the years. I've seen a lot of things, and I see these projects. When I was younger, I didn't know the difference, right? I didn't know what that was supposed to be like. I saw it, and there were a few cows in there off and on, and there were, blackberries growing up and different things. And, I didn't give it a lot of thought. And now, since I've worked for the tribes about 20 years now, and then I retired and came on to tribal council, but I've seen what can be accomplished with collaboration and working together with others. And I'm watching it happen in real time right there. And so when I see the potential for what could happen with these wind turbines, if, not knowing what the consequences are, they didn't know what the consequences were for filling in all this property over here. They didn't know.
That was a dairy, right? It
Yes.
was a large dairy.
Yep. They didn't know what the consequences of that were. The same as we don't know what the consequences of that is going to be. And to put it in or just push it ahead without knowing what those consequences are, it could be disastrous. And so, and this is, again, it's hard to put into words, but the feelings I have for the restoration projects that we're working on, as opposed to what the potential harm could be with these projects, how do we as people, how do we justify that without knowing what's there?
And it sounds like this restoration has been taking a long time and is pretty expensive as well.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like a wonderful project, but at the same time, it's not easy.
No.
To do.
No, and consider how much more difficult it's going to be 30 miles offshore. Mm-hmm. If we have to do restoration out there, recovery,
Now, your tribe is not the only tribe in the U.S. that's concerned about offshore wind or about various other clean energy projects, solar, onshore wind, etc. At the same time, some tribes are working to develop clean energy projects of their own. And they're also dealing with the impacts of climate change, the disappearance of traditional foods. I'm wondering, is your tribal confederation feeling the impacts of climate change in addition to the many, problems that have been caused in the past by development? Is climate change making things worse? And are you hoping to develop clean energy as a tribe as well?
We are actually working on some, and they're smaller scale, but we're adding solar to our tribal administration building. Mm-hmm. And they're building that out right now. So yes, we are working on some green energy projects of our own. Granted, we're pretty small scale with that, but we're looking into other options for that as well. Now, we also have to look at, and we have our staff who are Department of Natural Resources, our Tribal Historic Protection Officer is, watching these projects as well to make sure that we're not having a negative impact. So, we're trying to move ahead with those kinds of things as well, but cautiously, mm-hmm. And some of the more obvious impacts to climate change are the fires we have, mm-hmm. and that's not solely climate change. That's also some poor management as well. But, those are probably the most obvious things that we see as far as climate change, because we deal with, increased fire danger, and we also deal with smoke. The last 10 years here, I've seen smoke here that I never, ever saw as, young when I was younger. And so, those are the most obvious ones.
Interesting. So you're starting to feel the urgency as well to address this. In the scope of our conversation, how do you feel we should go about developing these clean energy projects, whether it be offshore or onshore wind, whether it be solar, whether it be geothermal, there's probably going to be others, nuclear, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to need these, not just for clean electricity, but to reduce our emissions, to try to slow down these climate impacts. How do we develop these projects in a responsible way?
Well, Rick could probably better answer this, but follow the rules. We have rules in place, laws in place to try to protect that environment. And by saying, and I've heard this quoted, if we don't do this, we're all going to die, basically. And if we have to kill off a few species in doing it, so be it. It's not a responsible way to do business. I think you can do both, and we have to try to make sure that we do that, and we know what those impacts are going to be before we do it, as best we can.
Protect those species, mm-hmm. and try to develop the projects.
Yes.
If I could just add, and the chair, I think, touched on this, is, follow the law, but also, if this is so important, take the time to do it right. It shouldn't be rushed through. Let's do the studies. Let's bring people together to build a consensus of what is needed. The other thing I think that's really important to look at with projects like this is what's going to happen with this power. Offshore wind is very, very expensive power. Oregon right now does not have the facilities to even accommodate, this power. How is it going to connect to the grid? Where is it going to go? Is it ultimately going to go to California? The other thing is, are we using this to replace fossil fuels, or is this going to feed future demand? I think that's one of the bigger issues that, as a country and as a state, Oregon needs to take a look at is are things like electrification and, other increased electricity demand affecting power development. I think it's admirable to look at what are fossil fuel sources in Oregon and how do we replace those. But it's another thing to develop a suites of energy just to feed our increasing energy demand. And I think things like and what I've heard a lot of tribal members and tribal leaders say is we need to think about conservation. We can't just keep putting windmills and solar panels out there. We're gonna run out of space, and we need to get a handle on that thirst for energy that isn't being satisfied.
I want to bring us back to offshore wind at the very end, which is, what is our path forward in terms of offshore wind turbines? Do you still feel like this process can be done right? Is there a future for offshore floating wind turbines in Oregon?
Well, floating offshore wind might be the best thing ever. Who knows? But, it needs to be done right, and we need to know what those impacts are. And, if they're actually going to produce what they say they're going to produce, because right now it feels like they're just trying to bust them out there to fulfill a promise. And, we also have to, it's also about money. I mean, these companies that are going to do these, or we're going to do these leases, they stand to make money on this. And I'm not opposed to companies making money, don't get me wrong. But at what point is it about making money, and what is, where's the line? Is it, how much of it is just about making money or fulfilling promises, and how much of it is about saving the environment?
Well, I appreciate you both. This has been a really important conversation, and we're going to be following this topic in future stories in the Oregonian and online at Oregon Live. And I'll drop a few links to the stories in the show notes and the online post. Thank you so much for listening to Beat Check with the Oregonian. If you like this show, please give us a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It helps people find the show. The best way to support our journalism and stories like this is with a subscription to Oregon Live. You can do that at OregonLive.com/pod support. Until next time, thank you.